June 1943, the Atlantic. A convoy of Liberty ships moved slowly through calm waters, gray hulls fading into the mist. On their decks stood hundreds of captured German soldiers, quiet, pale, and staring toward the horizon. They had fought across North Africa, from Tunisia to the desert passes, believing they'd been sent to the edge of the world. Now they were heading somewhere even further. None of them knew exactly where they were going. Rumors spread in low voices. England, perhaps, or a camp on some barren island. But the truth was stranger and far more humbling. They were being sent to the United States. When the first ships reached the East Coast, the prisoners expected ruins. They had been told America was a land of chaos, poor, weak, full of propaganda and disorder. The Reich's films had painted a picture of a country unprepared for real war. What they saw instead left them speechless. As they were marched down the gangways, their eyes widened. The ports were alive with cranes, trucks, and workers moving in perfect rhythm. Mountains of cargo, tanks, jeeps, and crates, stamped U.S. Army ordnance, rose higher than any building they'd seen in Europe. Conveyor belts clattered day and night, and ships were being loaded faster than they could dock. This was not a country at war. It was a continent in motion. From New York to Norfolk, every harbor told the same story. Steel, organization, and abundance. The German prisoners couldn't believe it. They had spent years hearing how America's economy was weak, its people lazy, its factories inefficient. But here the evidence roared in their faces. Rows of Liberty ships, each built in weeks, not months. Train yards packed with supplies, food, and munitions. Even the guards wore fresh uniforms, their rifles spotless. For the first time, the prisoners realized what they were truly up against. The Reich had built its empire on conquest. America had built its war machine on production. The trains carried them inland, across miles of countryside they never imagined, through green fields, quiet towns, endless farmlands. Everywhere they looked, there were cars, roads, and bridges, untouched by war. No bomb craters, no ruins, no ration lines. To men who'd watched cities like Hamburg and Cologne burn, the sight was disorienting, almost surreal. While Europe bled, America seemed untouched, unscarred, and unstoppable. When they finally reached the camps, places like Fort Knox, Camp Shelby, and Fort Robinson, the shock deepened. The fences were tall, the guards alert, but the camps themselves were orderly, clean, even humane. Barracks had showers, mess halls served warm meals, and prisoners were given soap, clothes, and medical care. Many had not seen such comfort in years. Some expected interrogation, punishment, even execution. Instead, they were handed work schedules and payslips. For every day, they labored in the fields or workshops. They earned credits redeemable for cigarettes, chocolate, and writing paper. The Americans called it the Geneva Convention. To German soldiers raised under Nazi discipline, the concept was almost absurd. Prisoners treated as men, not enemies. But it was what they saw outside the fences that changed them most. Every week, buses carried them through nearby towns to cut lumber, harvest crops, or build roads. And there, through the windows, they saw the full scale of what they had once called inferior. Factories stretching beyond sight, filled with workers, men and women side by side, turning out trucks, ammunition, engines, children walking to school with lunches wrapped in wax paper, supermarkets overflowing with food, civilians smiling at soldiers, a nation not merely surviving war but thriving through it. Many POWs later said their first real defeat didn't come on the battlefield. It came on those train rides through America, because what they saw shattered everything they had been told about the world. They had fought believing Germany stood as the most advanced industrial power on earth. But here they saw an enemy that built ships faster than the Reich could destroy them, tanks faster than the front could consume them, and airplanes in numbers that defied reason. In Germany, factories hid in tunnels and forests to escape the bombers. In America, factories worked with their doors open, proud and loud, day and night. The realization spread through the camps like a whisper. They could never lose, one POW wrote, not with this. At night, as they lay in their bunks, the sound of distant locomotives echoed through the countryside. Long, steady, endless. It was the sound of an industrial heartbeat, a rhythm the Reich could never match. And the more they heard it, the more they understood. The war had been decided long before they set foot on American soil. It wasn't decided by generals or by tanks, but by assembly lines, blueprints, and workers who never stopped. For the German soldiers behind the wire, it was a revelation and a humiliation. They had been trained to see America as weak, but here they saw strength in every field, every factory, every face. One sergeant from the Africa Corps later said, "In Germany, we thought we were fighting a country. In America, I saw we were fighting a civilization." They woke each morning to a whistle, not the shriek of bombs or sirens, but the crisp sound of routine. The camp came alive, footsteps on gravel, mess tins clattering, voices calling names in German accents softened by months of surrender. For many, it was the first time in years they slept without fear of death. Inside the camps, discipline still ruled. German officers insisted their men stand for roll call, boots polished, hair trimmed. The Americans allowed it. They understood pride was the only thing some of these men still owned. But beneath that order, something else began to change. At first, the prisoners kept to themselves. They sang old marching songs, painted German flags on scraps of cloth, and whispered about returning home once the war turned. Few believed Germany could truly lose. But the news filtered in, quietly, through guards, newspapers, and the radio that sometimes played from the mess hall. Sicily had fallen, Rome was taken, Normandy had been invaded. Each headline chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. And with every passing week, life inside the wire became less about waiting and more about learning. The prisoners of war were assigned to work across the American countryside. They harvested wheat in Kansas, picked cotton in Texas, built roads in the Carolinas, and logged pine forests in the Pacific Northwest. They saw a country that was vast, free, and strangely united. Civilians waving at convoys, farmers shaking hands with guards, children riding bicycles near the fences without fear. In Germany, the state ruled everything. In America, everything seemed ruled by cooperation. The German officers tried to maintain discipline. Do not talk to the guards. Do not speak to civilians. But it was impossible to keep the world out. Farmers offered coffee. Shopkeepers shared sandwiches. One captured sergeant recalled a family leaving a pie cooling by the window of the farmhouse he worked near. When he returned the next day, another one was waiting. It was, he wrote later, the first time I doubted everything I believed. The prisoners began to see the cracks in the propaganda they'd been fed. They had been told America was a land of chaos and crime. Instead, they saw abundance and order. They were told American soldiers were crude and cowardly. Instead, they saw discipline, confidence, and fairness. Even the guards treated them with a kind of detached respect, firm but human. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where Germany demanded obedience, America offered responsibility. Where the Reich ruled through fear, the Americans ruled through structure. The prisoners, most of them in their 20s, had been raised to worship efficiency and control. But what they saw here was something deeper, freedom that worked. Many prisoners of war began using their time in the camps to study. Some learned English, others requested books from local libraries. In one camp in Nebraska, German officers organized lectures on engineering and mathematics, while American officers quietly provided paper, pencils, and textbooks. The war outside raged on, but inside, men who once fought for the Reich were rebuilding themselves, quietly, piece by piece. Letters home became different too. Early on, they were full of arrogance, assurances that Germany would rise again. By late 1944, the tone had shifted. Some wrote of the kindness they'd seen. Others warned their families that the Allied war machine was unstoppable. A few, more daringly, admitted something unthinkable, that America wasn't their enemy anymore. At night, conversations turned philosophical. In the barracks, men debated what the war had been for and whether victory, any victory, could justify what they'd seen in Europe. They talked about the towns they'd seen from train windows, the farms, the cities that glowed with light even during rationing. The phrase "so viel, so much" became common. So much land, so much food, so much energy. Some refused to accept it. Hardliners still shouted slogans, clung to swastika pins hidden in mattresses, and waited for orders that would never come. But for most, the longer they stayed, the quieter they became. The true shock wasn't material. It was moral. They realized the world they'd been fighting against wasn't weak. It was strong because it didn't need to be cruel. The enemy they were taught to despise had shown them dignity. When word came that the war in Europe had ended, the reaction was not joy. It was silence. Men stood still in the spring sunlight, processing a truth that would echo for the rest of their lives. They had fought for a regime that promised supremacy and lost to a nation that built everything they could not: trust, equality, and the ability to work together. In the weeks that followed, the camps changed. Guards became friendlier. Fences were less watched. Some prisoners of war were invited to American homes for dinner, supervised but welcomed. And everywhere they went, they saw the same thing: people who lived without fear of their own government. That, more than the machines, the radios, or the factories, was the greatest shock of all. Because behind all the power and production, there was something invisible yet immense. A belief in freedom that powered everything else. And for thousands of German prisoners, that realization would stay long after the war ended, long after they went home, and long after the world forgot their names. When the war ended, the fences didn't open all at once. For months, the German POWs remained behind wire, watching the headlines shift from battles to reconstruction. Europe was in ruins. Cities they had once fought for, Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, were little more than ash and twisted steel. In the camps, the mood was heavy. Some men wept openly when they received letters from home, describing hunger, cold, and fear. Others sat silently, staring at the photographs of what had once been their towns. The contrast between the world outside and the quiet order of the American camps became almost unbearable. Then slowly, the departures began. Trains pulled into the sidings filled with men in worn uniforms, duffel bags over their shoulders, unsure what waited for them on the other side of the ocean. They didn't leave as the same men who had arrived. Months, sometimes years, in America had changed them in ways no propaganda could reverse. They had worked beside civilians who treated them as laborers, not enemies. They had learned how systems of trust, not fear, could move mountains of steel and grain, and they had seen firsthand that freedom, when organized and disciplined, could outbuild any dictatorship on earth. As the ships carried them back across the Atlantic, some talked quietly on the decks, looking back toward the coast they were leaving behind. The lights of New York faded into the horizon, silent proof of the power that had defeated them. For many, the real revelation came after they returned home. Germany was unrecognizable, factories destroyed, families scattered, children hungry, and everywhere ruins, mile after mile of rubble. In towns like Cologne and Kassel, men who had once walked proudly through American streets now picked their way through craters. They saw the contrast clearer than ever. In America, they had seen life go on, cities untouched, people free. In Germany, they saw the cost of believing in a lie. At first, they were treated with suspicion. Some civilians saw them as traitors for having surrendered. Others called them lucky. But those who listened realized something deeper had happened. These returning POWs carried something back that Germany desperately needed, a vision of how a nation could be rebuilt without tyranny. They told stories of farms that ran efficiently without party orders, of factories that operated through cooperation instead of command. They described American towns where ordinary citizens had access to food, cars, education, and opportunity. Not through control, but through freedom. Many of them would become teachers, engineers, and local leaders in the new Germany. And quietly, the lessons they learned in the American camps began to shape the next chapter of their country's history. Sociologists later called it the re-education without force. The Americans hadn't set out to convert anyone. They had simply shown through everyday life what democracy looked like when it worked. One former Wehrmacht officer, who later became a civil servant in West Germany, wrote, "We came to America as soldiers of a powerful nation. We left as witnesses of a greater idea." In the 1950s, as Germany began its economic miracle, the echoes of that idea were everywhere, in the rebuilt factories, in the new constitution, in the emphasis on fairness, productivity, and personal responsibility. Many of the same men who had once fought under the Reich now found themselves helping to build a democracy modeled on the very country that had defeated them. Historians often measure victory in battles won or cities captured. But in truth, one of America's quietest victories of World War II wasn't fought with tanks or bombers. It was fought with decency, the steady, unyielding strength of a nation that showed its enemies a better way to live. By the time the last German POW boarded a ship home in 1946, America had housed over 425,000 prisoners of war in more than 500 camps across the country. Almost all returned home alive. And thousands later admitted that captivity in the United States had been the moment their worldview changed forever. They had arrived expecting vengeance and humiliation. They left with something far more dangerous to tyranny, admiration, because they had seen the secret that made the United States undefeatable, not its weapons, not its wealth, but its people. Millions of ordinary men and women who built, shared, and believed in something larger than themselves. That realization stayed with them for decades. Some wrote books, others kept silent but taught their children differently. And through them, an entire generation of post-war Germans carried the memory of what they had witnessed in the land of their former enemy. A land where even prisoners of war discovered freedom. In the years that followed, time did what war could not. It turned memory into perspective. By the 1950s, many of the former POWs were settled back into civilian life. Some were engineers rebuilding bridges across the Rhine. Others worked in the new factories of Munich, Dortmund, and Hamburg, where the hum of machines finally returned, softer, steadier, and now powered by democratic hands. But within that generation, something subtle had shifted. They no longer saw strength in oppression or order in fear. They had lived through both, the rigid machinery of Nazi command and the quiet efficiency of American freedom. And they knew which one truly worked. Letters from that period reveal the quiet transformation of thought. Former tank commanders wrote about the respect shown by their American guards. Pilots who had once bombed convoys over North Africa described the astonishment of seeing American cities unscarred, productive, and calm. And young infantrymen, once the backbone of the Reich's war machine, now raised children who grew up believing in peace, productivity, and dialogue over domination. In villages across West Germany, they spoke of what they had seen, not in speeches, but in small lessons passed through work and family. How cooperation built faster than coercion. How a nation could be powerful without being feared. How even enemies could act with fairness. The seeds planted in those camps took root quietly. They grew through the Marshall Plan, through Reconstruction, through the rise of the new Federal Republic. and in time they would form the moral foundation of a Germany reborn, not in arrogance but in humility and discipline. Many historians later looked back and found a strange irony in it all. The men who once vowed to destroy democracy became some of its earliest protectors in post-war Europe, not because they were forced, but because they had seen up close how it truly functioned. In a way, those camps in Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia became classrooms, not of ideology, but of humanity. Every handshake from a farmer, every smile from a child, every simple act of decency had left a mark deeper than any Allied speech or leaflet could. When some of those men returned decades later, as tourists or businessmen, they found the same towns where they had once been prisoners. A few visited the families that had offered them coffee or kindness, and many admitted something extraordinary, that the years spent in captivity had been the most important education of their lives. One veteran, a former artillery officer from Bavaria, wrote before his death in 1973, "America did not conquer us, it convinced us." And that was the greater victory. By then, the world had changed again. New wars, new tensions, a new balance of power, but the lesson remained timeless. Real strength is not measured by what you destroy, but by what you build. The German soldiers who once arrived on American shores as prisoners had witnessed the full force of that truth. They had seen a nation that didn't need to shout its power. It demonstrated it through abundance, efficiency, and fairness. And in doing so, America accomplished something even greater than defeating the Third Reich. It reshaped the hearts of the men who once fought for it. Because when those German POWs looked at the vast farms, the endless factories, the cities that never slept, they weren't just seeing machinery. They were seeing the spirit of a nation that believed in possibility. A country that turned steel and sweat into freedom itself. And that, more than any bomb or bullet, was the weapon that changed the world.